The Caribbean is in turmoil again, as Trump and Maduro are both preparing and assembling military forces to deal with each other. So what is America's ultimate goal in the Caribbean? Let's analyze this content in today's video. The Caribbean Sea is calm at dawn, a deceptive beauty. Beneath the peaceful surface, a storm is brewing, not of nature but of nations. American warships cut across the horizon, silhouettes sharp and decisive. On the coast of Venezuela, radar dishes swivel north and fighter jets roar overhead. The eyes of the world are elsewhere, Europe, Gaza, Taiwan, but the old battlefields of empire are awake again. This is not 1960, yet it feels like déjà vu. The same waters that once held Soviet missiles now churn beneath the boots of another American president, this time Donald Trump, a man determined to show that Washington still rules the hemisphere. His administration has branded Nicolás Maduro a criminal dictator, a puppet of Moscow and Beijing. And with that, the chessboard is set. The Caribbean, once a playground of trade and music, now hums with military tension. Trump's order was subtle at first. Maritime security operations, the Pentagon called it. But the message was clear: a carrier strike group, surveillance aircraft, and destroyers now patrolling near Venezuela's maritime border. On the other side, Maduro responded with his own theater of strength, announcing Operation Bolivarian Shield. Venezuelan troops moved to coastal bases, Russian-made Sukhoi jets took flight, and oil tankers from allied nations began shifting their routes. The U.S. called it a deterrent. Caracas called it provocation. The world called it dangerous. But this was never just about Venezuela. It was about the principle, the unspoken rule that Washington has tried to enforce for 2 centuries. The Western Hemisphere belongs to America. The Monroe Doctrine, written in 1823, still echoes through the corridors of power disguised behind modern language about stability, democracy, and security. And so once again, the ghosts of empire sailed through the Caribbean wearing new uniforms, but carrying the same ambition, dominance. And so once again, the ghosts of empire sail through the Caribbean wearing new uniforms, but carrying the same ambition, dominance. The parallels are haunting. In 1962, it was Kennedy versus Khrushchev, nuclear missiles in Cuba, the world holding its breath. In 2025, it's Trump versus Maduro, sanctions, warships, and cyber battles, but the same primal contest. Who owns the Americas? Trump, ever the showman, knows the spectacle matters as much as the substance. He thrives on confrontation, on the image of the strong American president facing down tyrants. But this is not a show without consequences. Venezuela's military, though battered, is not defenseless. Its alliance with Russia and China gives it more leverage than any small nation should possess. And in the Caribbean, minor miscalculations have always led to big wars. As the tension builds, the rhetoric grows darker. Washington talks of humanitarian responsibility. Caracas warns of foreign invasion. Every phrase becomes a loaded gun, aimed not just across the sea, but into the hearts of millions who remember what happens when the empire comes calling. Analysts in Washington whisper about oil influence and optics. Analysts in Latin America talk about survival. And in between, on the open waters, lie fishermen, families, and islands caught in a storm not of their making. Trump's true calculus remains opaque. Is it about forcing Maduro to bend? About sending a message to China? Or simply reminding the world and voters back home that America can still flex its muscles when challenged? Perhaps it's all three. But one thing is sure, this isn't an isolated flare-up. It's part of a broader pattern, a reassertion of American primacy in its so-called backyard. The Caribbean once again becomes the testing ground for empire. And as night falls over the sea, The glow of distant radar screens paints an eerie reflection across the waves, the face of a world returning to its old habits, its old fears. Because beneath the slogans, beneath the politics, there is one truth history never lets us forget. When the United States feels its power slipping, it doesn't retreat, it reclaims. And tonight in the Caribbean, the empire stirs again. The United States doesn't send destroyers into tropical waters for freedom. It does so for geometry, for control, for the same strategic logic that built its dominance after 1945. Whoever controls the gateways of trade controls the future. In Washington, they call the Caribbean the pivot of the hemisphere. In the Pentagon, they call it America's third coastline. To the rest of the world, it's just an ocean of blue. But for the U.S., it's the front porch of power. The map tells the story. From Puerto Rico to Guantanamo Bay, from Colombia's northern bases to the new radar installations in Aruba and Curacao, the United States surrounds Venezuela like a patient hunter. Each military site is a dot, but together they form a triangle, a silent cage. Inside that cage sits the largest proven oil reserve on the planet. Caracas holds more crude than Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Russia. Yet its people starve, its currency collapses, its ships rot in port. Why? Because in geopolitics, resources aren't wealth, they're leverage. And whoever dictates how those resources flow dictates who rises and who falls. That is America's quiet fear. Not that Maduro is robust, but that he's useful to Russia, to China, to BRICS in their effort to build a post-Western world. In Beijing's calculus, Venezuela is a node in a grand alternative network, one that bypasses Washington, one that pays in yuan, not dollars. In Moscow's eyes, Caracas is a fortress, a beachhead to irritate Washington the same way NATO irritates Russia on its borders. And in Trump's eyes, it's a test, a stage to prove that America first still means America commands. This is the grand chessboard in motion. Each ship deployment, each sanction, each speech about democracy is a move. Deliberate, symbolic, psychological. The Monroe Doctrine, written 2 centuries ago, may seem dusty, but it's alive in the bloodstream of American policy. No foreign powers in our hemisphere. That was the rule then, and it's still the rule now, except today the foreign power is China building ports, or Russia selling missile systems, or BRICS proposing a new global bank. To Washington, that's not economics. That's intrusion. So Trump's administration revives an old reflex, show the flag, flex the muscle, and remind Latin America, who still writes the rules. It's a message wrapped in patriotism, but rooted in anxiety. Because deep down, America knows it is no longer unchallenged. The 20th century's unipolar moment gone, the 21st century's competition is rising. Hence the choreography, sanctions to choke the Venezuelan economy, warships to demonstrate readiness, diplomatic visits to sway neighbors, every angle covered, every channel pressured, and always the same script, the language of moral righteousness. We're protecting democracy. We're restoring order. But the logic is older than democracy itself, preserve dominance at all costs. Look closely. And the Caribbean operation mirrors the entire U.S. global playbook. In Europe, it's NATO's expansion to contain Russia. In Asia, it's AUKUS and the South China Sea to contain China. In Latin America, it's the Freedom Corridor, a nice phrase for strategic encirclement. Trump, unlike the polished diplomats before him, doesn't hide behind soft language. His style is raw, loud, transactional, but the machinery beneath him is the same machinery that ran Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama. The empire has many faces, but one engine controls the periphery to sustain the core. And yet, there's irony here. For all its rhetoric about freedom, the U.S. now acts from fear. Fear that the dollar will lose its crown, that alliances will fracture, that China will write the next chapter of globalization. So it moves fast, loud, dramatic, like a giant trying to convince itself it's still young. Meanwhile, in Caracas, every American movement is read like an omen. Every sanction cuts deeper than any missile. Every carrier group off the coast reminds Venezuelans that sovereignty for small nations is a fragile illusion. But for Washington, this is a strategy, not cruelty. A cold calculation, crush one to warn the rest. As one former State Department official once whispered, we don't need to occupy Latin America anymore. We need to make sure no one else does. That single sentence captures the new doctrine, deterrence by dominance. The U.S. doesn't want Venezuela's oil. It wants the authority over who buys it, in what currency, under what rules. And the rules-based order, that phrase repeated like gospel, is really code for our rules, our order. Trump's rhetoric electrifies the base, but his Pentagon strategists see a broader horizon. They see the Caribbean as a buffer, a shield against Chinese influence creeping through South America's ports, fiber optic networks, and mining deals, because what's at stake is not just Venezuela's loyalty, it's Latin America's future orientation. Will it lean toward Washington or toward Beijing? So the U.S. acts early, loudly, decisively, not because it wants war, but because it wants clarity. This hemisphere is ours. And yet, beneath the bravado, there's fragility. Each intervention carries diminishing returns. Each new show of force invites new resistance. For every Venezuelan general intimidated, another Latin leader grows wary. For every oil shipment rerouted, another Chinese loan replaces American aid. And the Caribbean, once seen as a calm American lake, is beginning to ripple with alternative dreams. The empire can't yet see it, but the rest of the world can feel it. The harder Washington clings to its dominance, the faster the world learns to live without it. As Trump's fleet patrols under a tropical moon, the chessboard glows with movement unseen, quiet, relentless. The game isn't about who wins this week. It's about who will still be standing when the board itself changes shape. Because in geopolitics, as in chess, there's one rule even kings forget: the board always outlasts the players. Caracas doesn't sleep anymore. The nights are filled with the hum of generators, the rumble of military trucks, and the flicker of candlelight in apartment windows. Power outages are routine. Sanctions have strangled the economy, but not the resolve. Nicolás Maduro, the embattled heir to Hugo Chávez's revolution, now stands as both symbol and survivor, a man cornered by the empire, yet unwilling to kneel. To Washington, he's a tyrant. To much of Latin America's working class, he's a warning of what happens when a small country dares to defy the system. And Maduro knows this. He plays it well. His speeches broadcast across state TV are defiant hymns wrapped in Bolivarian nostalgia. We will not be colonies again, he declares, beneath the giant portrait of Simón Bolívar, his voice cracking under the weight of history. To the poor, it's hope. To the elite, it's a delusion. But to his generals and to his Russian and Chinese backers, it's a strategy. Behind closed doors, the Bolivarian Republic is fortifying itself. Russian military advisors have been spotted near La Orquilla Air Base. Chinese technicians work quietly on communication systems and satellite links. Cargo planes land at night with humanitarian supplies, some medical, some metallic. It's the old Cold War game revived, but this time the sides are blurred. Maduro's intelligence services track every American move. The U.S. fleet off the coast, the cyber operations, the diplomatic maneuvers in the OAS, all mapped, analyzed, countered, and somewhere deep in Caracas, an entire war room glows red with screens, every one showing a different threat. But Maduro's greatest weapon isn't military, it's narrative. He has positioned Venezuela as the heart of a new Latin resistance, the axis of defiance, stretching from Havana to Managua and quietly to La Paz and Buenos Aires. When Trump tightens sanctions, Cuba responds with solidarity. When U.S. diplomats call for regime change, Nicaragua issues a declaration of sovereignty. These aren't powerful nations, but they understand something Washington often forgets: the power of symbolism. To the streets of Latin America, the sight of U.S. warships near Venezuelan waters doesn't look like democracy enforcement. It seems like 1,898 all over again, the gunboat diplomacy that never truly ended. And every attempt to punish Maduro only fuels his propaganda. The Yankees fear our independence. He turns isolation into legitimacy, poverty into martyrdom, and every attack becomes proof that Venezuela still matters. There's a cruel irony here. The more Washington tries to crush Maduro, the stronger his image becomes among those who see America not as a savior but as an oppressor. In Bolivia, murals of Chavez reappear.
In Chile, student protesters wave Venezuelan flags with the word Resistencia painted in red. In Brazil, leftist movements whisper that Venezuela is standing for all of us. Meanwhile, the military drills continue.
Venezuelan frigates shadow U.S. destroyers at sea, keeping a 30-mile distance, never crossing the line, but never retreating either. A single miscalculation could spark a skirmish, yet both sides seem to prefer this theater of nerves. Each maneuver filmed, broadcast, weaponized for television. In this century, wars don't begin with invasions. They start with perception. And perception is where Maduro is fighting hardest. He floods state media with footage of school children saluting the flag, farmers harvesting crops, soldiers swearing oaths of loyalty. He visits military bases in fatigues, hugging soldiers, invoking Bolivar's spirit. It's not governance, it's survival through theater. But it works because it taps into something deeper than politics, the Latin American memory of humiliation, centuries of it. Even some U.S. allies like Mexico and Argentina have begun to question the aggression quietly. They speak in diplomatic tones, but their unease is apparent. Another intervention, another quagmire. Latin America has seen this film too many times. Panama, Grenada, Chile, Guatemala. It always ends the same way, with Washington claiming victory and the region left in ashes. And so Maduro waits not for triumph, but for time. He knows Trump's attention span is short. He knows Washington's politics are cyclical. If he can endure, if he can survive one more storm, perhaps the world's power map will tilt in his favor. After all, the longer the U.S. plays global policeman, the more stretched it becomes. And the more it intervenes, the more it loses the moral ground it claims to defend. For the moment, the Caribbean has become a mirror. On one side, America's projection of dominance, vast, technical, relentless. On the other hand, Venezuela's projection of defiance, desperate, symbolic, but stubbornly human. And in the middle lies the sea, reflecting both power and fragility, empire and endurance. When history looks back at this standoff, it may not remember the ships or speeches. It may remind us of something smaller the moment Latin America began to place itself again. Because even if Maduro falls, the memory of resistance won't. And the more the empire presses, the more that memory spreads from the jungles of Colombia to the streets of Buenos Aires, from the Andean peaks to the Caribbean coast. The flags may change, but the rhythm is the same. A slow drumbeat of defiance rising once more beneath the tropical sun. If the warships and speeches are the theater, then oil is the script and money the invisible ink in which it's written. For decades, Washington's strength has not come merely from military might, but from something subtler, more pervasive: the dollar. The green paper that powers global trade, defines global wealth, and underwrites global obedience. The empire's accurate weapon has never been its aircraft carriers, it's been its currency. Venezuela, sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserve, should be wealthy beyond imagination. Yet the paradox is cruel. The very resource that could free it has become the chain that binds it. Because to sell oil, you need markets, ships, and most of all, dollars. And when Washington cuts you off from the dollar, you are no longer a nation with oil. You are a nation holding barrels you cannot sell. That is the first layer of America's hidden agenda, financial siege disguised as moral policy. The sanctions regime, supposedly aimed at restoring democracy, is in truth a message to the entire global South: cross us and we'll starve your system. Every blocked transaction, every frozen asset, every corporate threat sends the same warning. Independence from the dollar comes at a devastating cost. But lately, the world has begun to test that cost. China buys oil in yuan. Russia demands payments in rubles. India experiments with rupee trade. And BRICS, the coalition once dismissed as symbolic, now talks openly of creating a shared currency for global exchange. If that happens, the petrodollar's supremacy, the financial backbone of the American century, begins to crack. And that's where Venezuela re-enters the story. For Beijing and Moscow, Caracas isn't just a partner. It's a foothold in America's hemisphere, a chance to anchor this new economic rebellion right under Washington's nose. For the United States, that is intolerable. A small sanctioned nation trading oil outside the dollar system would be like a virus in the bloodstream, one that, if left unchecked, could spread to Brazil, Argentina, even Mexico. So the mission isn't just to topple Maduro, it's to ensure that no one dares to follow his model. Trump's public narrative paints Venezuela as a humanitarian disaster, but his economic team sees something far more technical and far more dangerous, the risk of contagion. If Venezuela sells oil to China in yuan, and China resells that oil in its own currency, the chain of dollar dependency weakens. Multiply that by a dozen nations, and suddenly the rules-based order begins to wobble. This is why the U.S. response is not only military, but financial sanctions, blacklists, secondary sanctions, and asset freezes, all to keep the dollar's dominion intact. Oil in this context is no longer a commodity. It's a currency. Control oil and you control the flow of capital. Control the currency and you control the flow of history. Trump may shout about socialism, but what his Pentagon and Treasury fear most is substitution, the idea that the world can build systems that don't need America. That's why every sanction is paired with a naval deployment, every economic restriction with a show of strength. It's not just coercion, it's choreography. A performance for the world: defy us, and we'll remind you who runs the system. Yet the cracks are already visible. For every nation bullied into compliance, another finds a loophole. For every sanction, a workaround. For every blockade, a backdoor trade in crypto barter or yuan. Venezuela's role, then, is not just symbolic, it's structural. It sits at the crossroads of three converging revolutions. Energy, the fight over who controls the next generation of oil markets. Finance, the birth of a post-dollar order. Technology, the rise of digital trade routes immune to U.S. oversight. Trump's operation in the Caribbean may look like a traditional geopolitical move. Still, in reality, it's a preemptive strike in a financial war, a desperate defense of an old system running out of breath. Because if Venezuela succeeds in trading outside Washington's reach, if its oil flows without touching a U.S. bank, then the myth of financial omnipotence collapses. And when the myth dies, the empire trembles. History will not remember this confrontation as just another U.S. Latin American standoff. It will remember it as a pivot the moment the world's periphery realized that the center could be bypassed. And that, more than any missile, terrifies Washington. For centuries, empires have fought for territory. Now they fight for a transaction. The battlefield is not land or sea, it's currency itself. And in that invisible war, Venezuela is no longer just a country under siege. It's a signal flare glowing in the night, warning the world that the financial map is being redrawn. Night returns to the Caribbean, heavy and uncertain. The sea glows faintly under the moon, calm on the surface, restless below, like the world itself. From a distance, the U.S. Destroyers look almost serene, their lights glimmering across the black water. But to the fishermen of Trinidad, to the oil workers in Maracaibo, to the islanders who can now see foreign warships on their horizon, it feels like history repeating itself. The Caribbean, once the cradle of colonial conquest, is once again the frontier of empire. But this time the empires wear different names. This time the battle is waged not in plantations or ports, but in currencies, cables, and satellite signals. And yet the cost remains the same, paid by ordinary people. On the Venezuelan coast, families line up for hours to buy food that never seems enough. Fathers whisper to their sons about El Bloqueo, the blockade, as if it were a ghost that visits each night to take one more thing away. In Miami, exiles wave flags and demand freedom for Venezuela, unaware that every sanction meant to free their homeland tightens the rope around the people left behind. In Washington, policymakers talk of deterrence. In Caracas, they talk of dignity, but neither side speaks of peace. This is the tragedy of the modern empire. It never ends. It just changes disguise. Every generation promises that this time will be different, that this war will bring democracy, that this intervention will bring stability. But as I once wrote, empires die not when they lose wars, but when they lose their soul. America's soul, once anchored in ideals of liberty, is now trapped in the machinery of dominance. Its leaders speak the language of freedom while enforcing the logic of control. Its citizens believe they are spreading democracy, but what they export is dependency. And with every new operation, the moral debt grows heavier, because power once made a habit becomes addiction, and addiction demands escalation. The Caribbean is only the latest fix. The real disease lies deeper in the conviction that without supremacy, America ceases to exist. It is a fear older than Trump, older than the Pentagon, the fear of a world that no longer needs permission. But history has a way of humbling even the proudest empires. The Spanish thought they owned these waters once, then the British did, then the Americans. Each claimed permanence. Each was proven wrong. Now the waves roll the same as they did centuries ago, indifferent to flags, borders, or doctrines. The sea remembers what nations forget, that power is temporary, but consequence is eternal. Somewhere in that darkness between the coasts of Florida and Venezuela floats the future, uncertain, unclaimed, and watching. Will it be written by force or by cooperation, by arrogance or by understanding, by yet another empire, or by something new, a world where strength is measured not by control but by restraint? For now the guns remain silent. But silence is never peace. It's only the breath between storms. And as the night deepens, one can almost hear the whisper of the ocean, a quiet ancient voice reminding both Trump and Maduro and every power that will follow. Empires are not eternal. The tide belongs to no one.